Welcome to the Modise Network. Today marks Freedom Day, the day when 25 years ago, South Africans of all races stood in long queues waiting to vote for the first time. Apartheid had kept them separate. Democracy was now allowing the black majority to vote for the first time, following decades of the freedom struggle. Since 1994, our nation has experienced different challenges every step of the way and overcame some, but others are making a comeback. The reconciliation and nation building of Nelson Mandela seems to be unraveling. The institutions put in place are struggling, and the economy is basically at a standstill, and the nation is demoralized. How did we get to this point? I'll talk to the lawyer, researcher, and now author of the new book, Turning and Turning, Judith February, about her book and the health of our democracy. And then I'll focus on the criminal justice institutions and their response to the public revelations of the extent of corruption at state-owned institutions and in the higher echelons of the government. And I'll do this with the Democratic Alliance Member of Parliament, Diane Kohler-Barnett, and constitutional expert Lawson Naidu of KSAC. We'll end the show with an interview with the Gift of the Givers founder, Dr. Imtiaz Suleiman, and he will be talking to us about the devastation and tragedy of the flooding that claimed over 70 lives in KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. But first, we'll look at the history of our democracy through the eyes of our guest, Judith February. But first, I'm joined by my guest, Judith February, who is political analyst and author. And I'm inviting you to join the network with your comments using the hashtag the Modise Network. Now, Judith February has had extensive experience as researcher with IDASA and currently with the Institute of Security Studies. She's written a book called Turning and Turning. We are looking at the history of the democratic era through Judith's eyes. And a pleasure to have you with us, Judith February.
Thanks very much, Tim. It's lovely to be with you.
As I say, that basically what we find in the book, that you are sharing with us your attraction to political analysis and the kind of work that you've done over the years, the past 25 years. So, be my modern historian, if you will. It's 25 years of democracy from 1994 to now, but it was not just one continuous loop of democracy being sustained. We've had different experiences of this democracy. So tell me of the different eras of the modern times of South Africa.
Well, Tim, thank you. The book is really a summary, in a sense, or chapters around my experiences working for the Institute for Democracy in South Africa, IDASA. And I started working there in 1999. But of course, even then, we were doing work on the first parliament and how that first parliament was very much a sort of the halcyon days. 789 pieces of race-based legislation were scrapped during those years. You had the great and the good in Parliament, and it really was a time where anything was possible. And then comes 1999, and that's where I sort of start the book, because that's the first year of my working at IDASA. And what I try to do in the book is to sort of pepper it and intersperse it with some of the stories that were part of my career and part of my life as actually a lawyer who happened to become a political analyst. It's not a term I'm particularly fond of, but there it is. And so it really, the first bit of work I did at IDASA in 1999 was to look at the arms deal and to look at issues of transparency and accountability, whether we were getting value for money from the arms deal, but also particularly the way in which the arms deal and the associated corruption impacted on our democratic institutions, from the prosecuting authority to the public protector, the Auditor General's Office, the Public Accounts Committee and Parliament in general, and how it started a sort of small festering sore at the tip of the heart of our democracy. And what I do in the book is then trace that corruption and so on into our work on transparency with regard to political party campaign finance, and then also look at my experiences at the ANC conference in Polokwane, how deeply unpleasant that was, and also the undemocratic tendencies that seem to be springing up. What Joel Netshitenzile told me at Polokwane was alien to the ANC, the way in which that conference played itself out. And then, of course, I trace that to questions of state capture, because I believe that in the arms deal, the seeds of state capture were really planted.
Now, you know, many of us tend to look at the South African democratic history in terms of the personalities that were leading the nation at the time. For instance, we'll call it the Mandela era of the nation building and reconciliation time, and the Mbeki era of the African Renaissance and black economic empowerment, and of course the Zuma era, which we summarize as the state capture era. Is it fair, though, to summarize these eras in that way?
Well, I suppose it's an easy way to do it, but what I try to do in the book is to look at the questions around the arms deal, for example, and lest we forget that it was Thabo Mbeki. There was an intervention with regard to the arms deal. It was he who wrote the angry letter penned in the name of Jacob Zuma to try and stop the parliamentary investigation. So once you start tampering with institutions and once you start setting that precedent, it can only go downhill from there. And we, of course, saw that dramatically. Not that I'm in any way suggesting that the graft that we saw in the Zuma years is comparable to Mbeki's actions, but I think what we need to do is, in South Africa, we're very reactive. We're reactive to everything that happens emotionally and immediately. But it does, and what I try to do in the book, is to look back so that we can try not to repeat the mistakes of the past, because mistakes were made. And let's not forget, Tim, that, as you say, these eras were marked by personalities. Thabo Mbeki made us feel decidedly more uncomfortable about ourselves. He talked about the fact that we were two nations, that we needed a staircase between one economy and the next. He made us feel uncomfortable about race. Not necessarily a bad thing, because we see that we still have much unfinished business. And then the Zuma years, one can only describe rightly, as President Ramaphosa did, as 9 wasted years.
Now, we go back to pre-1994, the freedom struggle days. And I think a lot of South Africans, a lot of us thought that, you know, as soon as you get to the point of the elections of 1994 and you usher in democracy, then everything else is going to work out fine. It's going to be hunky-dory. And I think a lot of people who have memories of the past are greatly disappointed with what they've seen over the past 25 years, especially in the most recent times. But democracy is a hard thing to put together, isn't it? We're still learning, I suppose, at this time.
We are, Tim. And if you look, we've had 25 years, and we can't say that South Africa, in my view, is still a better place. You and I are having this conversation. Every single day, people are exercising their democratic rights. I mean, recently we had a very difficult conversation around burning of books and so on. And the president came out and said, you know, this is not what South Africa as a democracy stands for. And so every day we are having to build our democracy. I think the biggest mistake, in a sense, that, and we can all be guilty of this, is that after 1994, we sort of thought that we had arrived democratically, we could put up our feet, that everything would be taken care of. But in fact, what democracy is it's a marathon and not a sprint, as I say in the book, quoting Barack Obama's final speech to the United Nations. Marathon, not sprint. And that in fact what it needs is all of us every day to be exercising our rights, but also demanding that our politicians, those who are in power, are accountable and that we have transparent government. And building a democracy is work. And I think we've forgotten what that concept of work is in terms of our sense of entitlement of what a democracy should be. If we look at the United States, we can see that even older democracies can backtrack, they can backslide, and that nothing is ever guaranteed. We see an assault on institutions in the US and even in countries in Europe, and we will not be and cannot be immune from that, especially not in a young democracy like we are, and also in one where there are high levels of poverty, unemployment and inequality. We cannot afford to be complacent, and I think the Zuma years, what it did is, and if we can take some good out of that, is it sort of started to stir something up in us again. Civil society organizations, people taking to the streets and so on, to find our voice again. Business speaking out, maybe not as much as they should, but we cannot take the rights that we have for granted, because they can quite easily be taken away.
But then the drafters of the Constitution try to preempt some of the things that we have experienced over the years, coming up with institutions such as the Chapter 9 institutions on over and above the separation of powers, and also the fact that South Africa, is based on the rule of law and is a constitutional democracy. And this has led to other observers to opine that maybe the South African democratic system is too liberal for our own good, and that is why it's hard to deal with the issues that you raise of poverty, for instance, inequality. That if you had, let's say, a Rwanda-like situation, then you'd have seen much faster progress in rolling back poverty and inequality, as well as generating employment and dealing with the high unemployment rates in our nation.
Well, Tim, I think what we need to bear in mind that the Constitution is a framework. The Constitution is a framework for what our founders, and we're lucky that some of them are still alive, those who wrote the Constitution, who thought about these things. And it was an organic process. That the Constitution is a framework. It is an aspirational document, a framework for what a society would want to be. And so it will never be perfect. And that is, constitutions around the world have their pros and cons, and one can always pick holes in it. The question is whether that framework allows us to arrive at a more just and more equal society. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is the fact that it's become fashionable almost nowadays to criticize the Constitution, to say that it is a liberal Western document which was thrust upon us. We were sold out by Mandela when he negotiated this Constitution, and that things should never have been as they are. I think that is a sloppy analysis. It's also, it doesn't take into account the conditions of the day, the political conditions in South Africa, but also globally. And also what we have done in the South African Constitution, and I think this is progressive, we have entrenched socioeconomic rights, the right to healthcare, to housing, and so on. And what we have done is to say that those rights are progressively realizable. Now, one can say that, well, look at the situation we're in. Not everyone has a house and so on. But that's what the progressive realization of rights is. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think that if any politician can say that the reason why they haven't been able to do what they meant to do in terms of their mandate as a cabinet minister or as somebody in a municipality because of the Constitution, I would challenge them to point out how the Constitution has been a stumbling block. The Department of Justice and the HSRC did very interesting research on the court cases, the constitutional court cases on social justice ever since 1996 and the adoption of the final Constitution. And the outcome of that was that this is a progressive document and has been used by the courts for good. But what has been our challenge in South Africa is that we have had politicians who really have taken their focus off the road, and they have veered away from the constitutional mandate. And really, why are roads being washed away in Limpopo province? Because of corruption, because of bad tender processes, and one could go on and on and on. And to suggest that the Constitution is a stumbling block to that, or any macroeconomic policy, I think is simply not backed up by the facts. What we have seen in South Africa is politicians who have been interested in self-aggrandizement or who have lost their way instead of focusing on the people, and have not followed that constitutional framework. And in fact, Tim, if it wasn't for our constitutional framework, the if one can imagine this, the issues of state capture would have been far worse. It was Thuli Madonsela in her reports on Nkandla, for instance, her excellent work in various other cases with regard to public money which is being misspent and so on, the tenor of that office and of our constitutional court upholding the rule of law, which has actually stood between us and tyranny and the edge of an abyss.
Judith February is the author of the book Turning and Turning, exploring the complexities of South Africa's democracy, and we are traversing her time as researcher at IDASA, her observations as analyst, and of course, and all of those and the articles that she's written over the years compiled into this book. And we will be checking with her in a moment. Don't go away.